Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the Eternal Society Paradox argument against an infinite past, which involves a society with the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of its existence, being able to produce a logical contradiction. Notably, the past being finite has been used in arguments for theism involving the universe beginning to exist and thus requiring a cause. Part 1 describes the Eternal Society Paradox and the argument against an infinite past. Later parts I discuss some objections to the argument. Part 1. The Eternal Society Paradox Argument. The Eternal Society Paradox was inspired by the Grim Reaper Paradox. For more details on that, I'll link the original paper on the Eternal Society Paradox in the description. An eternal society is one that has existed for a beginningless infinite duration of time, and in each year they can do what we humans can do in contemporary society, such that in each year of its existence they can flip coins, make decisions based on the result of coin flips, and pass on information possessed in the current year to the next year. Because of the society's extremely modest abilities, it seems like an eternal society would be possible if an infinite past were possible. Note that by possible, I'm referring to metaphysical possibility, as opposed to, say, physical possibility. Scenario S1 is defined as follows. In the Eternal Society, there is a ritual known as the annual coin flipping tradition, which goes as follows. Each year they flip a coin. The coin comes up heads and they never did a particular chant in a prior year, then they do the chant. Otherwise, they do not do the chant for that year. Last year, the coin came up heads for the first time and they did the chant. It seems that scenario S1 would be possible if an eternal society is possible, and yet scenario S1 is not possible, because if it were possible, the second scenario, which the paper calls scenario S2, would also be possible. The Eternal Society has the aforementioned annual coin flipping tradition, but the coin came up heads each year of the infinite past. The coin flips are probabilistically independent events, so if it is possible for the coin to not come up heads each year until last year, then it would also have been possible for the coin to come up heads each year. If scenario S1 is possible, then scenario S2 is possible, but scenario S2 is not possible. Why? Well, if scenario S2 occurred, did they ever do the chant? They would have to have done the chant some year, because they would have done the chant last year if they hadn't done it yet, since the coin came up heads last year. And yet, every year you point to, there is a prior year in which they would have done the chant if they had not done the chant before. So they had to have done the chant, since the coin came up heads last year, yet they could not have done the chant. There is no year they could have done it. And so this scenario creates a logical contradiction. Here's the Eternal Society argument against an infinite past as described in the article. Though for clarity's sake, I'll number the premises differently. Again, S1 is where the coin came up heads for the first time last year, and S2 is where the coin came up heads each year of the infinite past. If an infinite past were possible, an eternal society would be possible. If an eternal society were possible, then S1 would be possible. If S1 were possible, then S2 would be possible. S2 is not possible. Therefore, an infinite past is not possible. This argument is logically valid, which means it's logically impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. A sound argument is a valid argument with true premises, so for this valid argument to be unsound, you need a false premise. In addition to being an interesting argument in its own right, this Eternal Society argument bears relevance to the Kalam cosmological argument, which argues that the universe began to exist and therefore has a cause. Some philosophers have then argued that the cause of the universe has theologically significant properties, like being timeless as the universe, due to the past being finite and thus time itself having a beginning. Some have also argued for the cause being a personal cause, but for this episode I'm going to focus on this argument for the past being finite. Part 2. Jimmy's Rebuttal. In this article, the author talks about a number of arguments used to support the Kalam cosmological argument, including mine. The author says the solution to the paradox is straightforward. The Eternal Society Paradox is presupposing a logical contradiction. How is this a solution? The fact that the Eternal Society Paradox in scenario S2 entails a logical contradiction is part of the point. It's not a solution to simply concede part of the claim. He later says the paradox presupposes a first and last element to a supposedly infinite series, so the Eternal Society Paradox commits what he calls the first and last fallacy. First, note that simply calling something a fallacy doesn't make it so. At any rate, the author describes the first and last fallacy as follows. The first and last fallacy occurs if and only if a person envisions a supposedly infinite series as having both the first and the last element. I didn't envision that, and neither did scenario S2. Indeed, part of the reason there's a contradiction is that the scenario, if anything, envisions that there is no first element. Another problem with the objection is that the Eternal Society Paradox argument is logically valid. So if the argument is unsound, which premise is false? This objection doesn't actually attack any premise of the argument. This sort of objection is actually red herring. For more on red herrings, see my red herring video in blog episode 8. When listening to objection against a logically valid argument, ask yourself, does this objection attack any premise of the argument? If it doesn't, you might have a red herring. because if the premises of a valid argument are true, the conclusion is true regardless of what else might be true. Such is the magic of logic. Part 3. Math. Some objections I've seen come from a lack of understanding relevant mathematics. To simplify the mathematics a bit, suppose in the annual coin flipping tradition, the Eternal Society is flipping a third coin each year, with heads and tails being the only two possible outcomes, and both having a probability of 50%. To describe some math terminology, with the caveat that definitions can vary somewhat by the author, in probability random experiment like flipping a third coin is called a trial. Mutually independent trials are where the probability of a given trial's outcome is unaffected by the outcome of other trials, including any combination of the outcomes of the other trials. A Bernoulli trial is when there are only two possible outcomes, the probability for the outcomes is the same at each trial, and the trials are mutually independent. A Bernoulli process is a finite or infinite sequence of Bernoulli trials, each having the same probability, etc. A sample space is a set of all possible outcomes of a random experiment. We can specify in the Eternal Society paradox that the infinite sequence of coin flips is a Bernoulli process. For example, the coin flips are mutually independent in the sense I specified earlier. As the lecture notes from MIT Open Course say, a Bernoulli process may be limited to a particular number of trials, e.g. 7 games or 10 coin tosses, or it may go on indefinitely, in which case we may regard as an infinite process. A finite Bernoulli sample space consists of all binary sequences of some particular length n. 1 denotes success, 0 denotes failure. In the infinite case, the sample space consists of all infinite binary sequences. When you think about it, this makes sense. Bernoulli trials are mutually independent. In our situation, the success or failure is heads or tails, both having non-zero probabilities, and thus both are possible. So the fact that the probability of a given trial's outcome is unaffected by the outcomes of other trials entails that which outcomes are possible for each trial is also unaffected by the outcomes of other trials. For each trial, both outcomes, for example heads or tails, are possible. Which outcome is possible is unaffected by the outcomes of other trials. Since every element in the sequence has the property of heads or tails both being possible regardless of the values of the other sequence elements, this permits any infinite sequence of the binary values. If that was a bit hard to follow, don't worry, this coin flip illustration might help, in which there is an infinite sequence of coin flip trials and each coin flip is probabilistically independent in the way described earlier. Suppose we have a third coin and the coin flips are mutually independent in the sense I described earlier. So for each trial, that is, for each coin flip sequence element, heads or tails is a possible outcome, and the possible outcomes of a coin flip is unaffected by the outcomes of other coin flips. In this infinite sequence of coin flips, can the first coin flip be heads? Yes, since for each trial, heads or tails is a possible outcome, which would include the first coin flip. Given that the first coin flip is heads, can the second coin flip also be heads? Yes, since the possible outcome of the second coin flip is unaffected by the outcomes of the other coin flips. Hence, both heads and tails can be used here. If the first two coin flips are heads, can the third one be also? Yes, because the possible outcomes of the third coin flip is unaffected by the outcomes of the other coin flips. Hence both heads and tails can be used here, and so on ad infinitum for all the remaining sequence elements. For each sequence element, both heads or tails can be used. And since the outcomes of heads is arbitrary here, for example, we could just as well have used tails, heads, tails for the first three sequence elements, and then choose whatever binary sequence we wish for the remaining sequence elements. This can be generalized so that the sample space consists of all infinite binary sequences. So why is this important? Isn't it obvious that any infinite sequence of heads and tails is possible when the coin flips are fair and probabilistically independent? Well, maybe it's obvious to a lot of people, including myself, but I've seen bad objections that rely on not seeing this to be the case. One objection is that the probability of getting an entire sequence of heads is equal to this value as n goes to infinity, which is a probability that goes to 0, which means this particular sequence is impossible. There are a number of problems here, but one thing to point out is that any particular infinite sequence of paired coin flips is 1/2 as n goes to infinity. So if probability 0 meant that were impossible, that would mean we couldn't do an infinite coin flip sequence at all. In reality, a probability of 0 doesn't necessarily mean impossible when the set of possible outcomes is infinitely large. Another objection I've seen stems from a misunderstanding of the law of large numbers, mistakenly believing that an infinite sequence of paired coin flips must have exactly the same number of heads as tails, such that it's impossible to have, for an example, a coin flip of all heads. But as I've shown here, given these conditions, any infinite binary sequence is possible. Part 4. The worst objection. The worst objection I've seen people make is denying this premise, denying that scenario S2 is impossible. It's a crazy objection. No professional analytic philosopher who understood this scenario would dispute it. But for those who weren't convinced by my prose reasoning for why scenario S2 is contradictory, behold the power of symbolic logic. I wrote a blog post on symbolic logic approaches to the Eternal Society paradox argument, and in one part of the page I translated certain basic necessary facts of scenario S2 in symbolic logic, like the fact that in a beginningless infinite past each year has a year before it, and I rigorously prove that self-contradiction arises from these facts using symbolic logic. If anyone's curious, I'll link the article containing the proof in the description below. Part 5 is Straw Man. Adelia Brown published a paper critiquing the Eternal Society paradox argument. Recall that this is the actual argument. Note the scenarios of S1 and S2. Again, in S1 the coin came up heads for the first time last year, and in S2 the coin came up heads every year, resulting in a contradiction. Brown, however, presents the argument this way, which is a bit of a straw man. If an eternal past were possible, Tystammer's Eternal Society scenario would be possible. Tystammer's Eternal Society scenario results in a paradox. Scenarios that result in a paradox cannot be possible. Conclusion, an eternal past cannot be possible. You might think I'm being overly critical here of saying this is a straw man, but ask yourself, which scenario is she calling Eternal Society scenario? Given P2 and P3 here, it should obviously be scenario S2, since that's a scenario premise the Eternal Society argument claims is not possible. And yet, she says this. P2 is not correct because Eternal Society scenario does not result in a paradox. The supposed paradox is that A, the society must have done the chant, but B, the society can never have done the chant. While B is true, A is not the case. It is true that the society could never have performed the chant, but it is not true that the society must have performed the chant. That doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? After all, it's an explicit part of the scenario that for each year, if the coin came up heads, they do the chant if they had never done it before. So by this description, if the coin came up heads, they must have done the chant. Of course, scenario S2 is a paradox. One can prove it leads to a contradiction with symbolic logic. So, is this just another case of the worst objection I talked about in part 4? Well, no it isn't, because it turns out that the Eternal Society scenario in her paper isn't really any scenario the Eternal Society argument actually talks about. She says, let us examine Tystammer's justification for part B of his paradox. No matter which year one points to, there is a prior year in which they would have done the chant had they not done the chant before. More accurate description would be that, no matter which year one points to, there is a prior year in which they would have done the chant had they not been informed that they had done the chant before. That is not more accurate, that is less accurate. Lest anyone be confused, that second quote, which contains the phrase been informed, doesn't exist in the original paper. I'm guessing this is just intended to be reformulation, even though it ends up being a straw man. With that said, I can understand how this straw man might have emerged, and it's my fault for not anticipating that this straw man might emerge. One has to distinguish between A, scenarios S1 and S2, and B, the mechanisms for how the Eternal Society might have brought about those scenarios, because they're not the same thing. To reiterate, this Eternal Society argument does not specify the means for how the Eternal Society brings about those two scenarios. Conflating these two scenarios with the way the Eternal Society might have brought about these scenarios seems to be the mistake Adelia Brown made. In the original Eternal Society paradox paper, one possible mechanism that was proposed is that the Eternal Society keeps track of whether they did the chant before, like on a web page or something. The Eternal Society is capable of transmitting information from the previous year to the next year. That way, when the coin comes up heads, they consult the web page to see if they ever did the chant before. And this is the mechanism for how they engage in the annual coin flipping tradition of doing the chant when the coin comes up heads, but only if they never did the chant before. In the situation where the coin always comes up heads, Adelia Brown proposes this society has never done the chant but has always existed as though it had. And every year, the society has received the message that they have done the chant in the previous year, despite the fact that they have never actually done it. The problem, of course, is that what Brown is describing here isn't any scenario the original paper talked about. In the message transmission scenario of the original paper, the Eternal Society had accurate information about whether they did the chant before. If you change the scenario so that they no longer had accurate information in the way Adelia Brown depicted, it's true that the contradiction wouldn't arise because at that point it would no longer be scenario S2. But then you're talking about a different scenario. None of this would attack any premise of the actual Eternal Society argument. But let's steelman this objection a bit. Remember, the message transmission strategy was intended to be a mechanism the Eternal Society could use to help practice the annual coin flipping tradition. One could make this objection against how successful that mechanism would be if the Eternal Society used it. With that in mind, consider this somewhat steel-manned version of the objection. Although in the original message transmission scenario, the information about whether they did the chant is accurate, even when the coin comes up heads each year, in reality, if the Eternal Society were to try doing the annual coin flipping tradition using a message transmission system, and the coin came up heads each year, the message that they would actually be transmitted is that they did the chant, even though they never did the chant before. Is that true? Well, not necessarily. While it's easy to imagine the Eternal Society transmitting a false belief about whether they did the chant year after year, it's also easy to imagine them transmitting the correct belief from year to year. I think both are possible if an Eternal Society is possible. But let's suppose that it's somehow impossible for the Eternal Society to transmit accurate information from one year to the next about whether they did the chant before. I don't think it is impossible, since it's something humans could do in contemporary society, and thus the Eternal Society would be able to do it. But suppose it is anyway. We could think of a different mechanism for them having a correct belief about whether they did the chant before. Notice that it's no part of these two scenarios that the Eternal Society has a justified true belief about whether they did the chant in the prior year. For all the scenarios care, their belief about whether they did the chant before is true but not justified. Also note that in each year, the Eternal Society either did the chant before or they didn't. So suppose the Eternal Society roll a couple dice each year, and if the result is an even number, they'll believe they did the chant in a prior year, otherwise they'll believe they didn't do the chant in a prior year. In which case, it's possible for the Eternal Society to have the correct belief about whether they did the chant before just by chance, and hence we have an alternate mechanism for correctly believing if they did the chant before in both scenarios S1 and S2. As for why they base the belief on the rolling dice outcome, maybe the Eternal Society acts this way because they have a false belief that the dice gods reveal the truth by controlling the outcome, even though the outcome is a product of random chance. At any rate, we can imagine that, by chance, the results of the rolled dice happen to line up with the correct answer of whether they did the chant before in each year. Note that rolling the dice and flipped coins are probabilistically independent events, so it is possible that in this scenario for the rolling dice to yield correct results, and for the coin to come up heads each year, so that in every year the coin comes up heads, and they have the correct belief about whether they did the chant in a prior year. With that, we have our mechanism for scenario S2, and we still get a contradiction. One thing worth pointing out here is that Brown's objection didn't attack the truth or justification of any premise of the actual deductive argument. If the argument's premises are justifiably true, then the conclusion is also true and the argument is sound, regardless of what else might be true. Something I think is important to learn from this is to beware any objection that doesn't attack the truth or justification of any premise in a logically valid argument. Because to reiterate, if a logically valid argument's premises are justifiably true, the conclusion is correct regardless of what else might be true. Part 6. Attacking the second and third premises. One could disagree with the second premise, say that the Eternal Society is possible they couldn't engage in the annual coin flipping tradition to bring about scenario S1, because practicing that tradition could create a contradiction via scenario S2. But given the aforementioned abilities of the Eternal Society, this strikes me as implausible. After all, what would have happened if in each year they tried to flip a coin and do the chant when the coin comes up heads, with the added condition that they don't do the chant if they did it in a prior year, particularly with respect to scenario S1? One could say that what stops them is the fact that it could create a contradiction. To illustrate why I don't think this sort of response makes sense, consider the grandfather paradox, whereby if one went back in time when their grandfather was a child and they killed their grandfather, they never would have been born and thus couldn't have gone back in time to kill their own grandfather, thus creating a contradiction, at least with the sort of time travel I'm talking about, where you time travel within your own time stream such that you can affect your own past. Now, suppose someone talks to another person who believes that time travel within one's own time stream is possible, so that a person could affect their own past, and the conversation goes like this. So I could go back in time with a loaded gun when my grandfather was a child, within my own time stream, in the sense that it's a sort of time travel where I could change my own past and thus change my own present.
Yes.
But then if I'm there with a loaded gun, I could kill my own grandfather when he was a child.
No, you couldn't, because that would create a contradiction.
But once I was there in the past with a loaded gun, what would stop me from actually killing my grandfather?
The fact that it would create a contradiction.
But what would happen if I actually tried to do it by aiming my loaded gun and pulling the trigger?
The fact that it would create a contradiction would stop you from doing it. Sheesh, have you been paying attention?
Clearly that's not a good explanation, but why doesn't this explanation work? Well, it's true that if I were to kill my own grandfather in the grandfather paradox scenario, I would create a contradiction. So, because it would create a contradiction is in a sense an explanation for why I couldn't kill my own grandfather. But it's not an explanation for the question at hand. Because given the possibility of traveling back in time with one's own time stream with a loaded gun to where and when one's grandfather was a child, it seems like it would be possible for me to kill my own grandfather. So simply saying, because it would create a contradiction, isn't a real explanation for why I wouldn't be able to kill my own grandfather, given the possibility of that within your own time stream time travel. At that point, I need something more concrete to stop me from aiming the gun and pulling the trigger. Instead, it seems more plausible that such time travel was never possible in the first place. Similarly, I think you're going to need something more concrete to stop the Eternal Society from bringing about scenario S1, given the Society's explicitly defined abilities. It seems more plausible that the Eternal Society was just never possible in the first place. Another way to think about it is that Given the possibility of traveling back in time within your own time stream to where and when your grandfather was a child, it's as if you need to possess some mysterious force to prevent you from killing your own grandfather if you tried to do so. The same thing applies to the Eternal Society paradox. Once you're given an Eternal Society with the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of its existence, such that in each year they can flip coins, make decisions based on coin flip results, and so forth, it's as if you need to appeal to some mysterious force to prevent them from engaging the annual coin flip tradition and bringing about scenario S1. What's to stop the Eternal Society from, in each year, flipping a coin and so forth, given the existence of an Eternal Society with all its specified abilities? The fact that it created a contradiction doesn't seem to work as a real explanation here, for the same reason it doesn't in the grandfather paradox scenario. One could ask this:
does this mysterious force thing really apply when you're talking about people trying to bring about a logical contradiction? After all, why isn't some mysterious force needed to stop someone from creating a married bachelor making 2 + 2 = 5?
An important factor is that in the cases of the Eternal Society paradox and the grandfather paradox, the conditions specified in those two cases seem to suggest that the contradictory state of affairs would be possible if those specified conditions were possible. That's not the case for someone's next door neighbor trying to make 2 + 2 = 5. The same idea applies even more so for the third premise, since the gap is even smaller there. Scenarios S1 and S2 are the same apart from the outcome of a random experiment, namely, the results of an infinite sequence of coin flips. So if one is possible, then so is the other. To illustrate the principle with a different pair of scenarios, suppose in scenario M1 a married bachelor be created if and only if a certain flipped coin comes up heads, but in this case the coin comes up tails. In M2 is the same situation as before except that the coin comes up heads. It stands to reason that if M2 is impossible and so is M1, because the possibility of M1 implies the possibility of M2, since the dispositions of what will occur given the outcome of a random experiment are the same in both cases. The same principle applies to S1 and S2. The dispositions of what will occur given the outcome of a random experiment are the same in both cases. Consequently, rationality dictates that if S1 is possible, then so is S2, and thus that the Eternal Society's annual coin flipping tradition was never possible in the first place. Part 7. A better objection. If I were to go after the Eternal Society argument, I'd attack the first premise. Note that I had arguments for the second and third premises being true. Reasons to believe that if the Eternal Society existed, it could bring about scenario S1 since, by definition, the Eternal Society can in each year flip coins, base decisions on coin flip results, and so forth, but I didn't really have an argument for the first premise. It seems true to me intuitively, but that's not much of an argument, is it? Someone could deny the first premise, but as the original Eternal Society paradox paper says, surely there is something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past, and the Eternal Society with the abilities of ordinary humans can actualize logical contradiction. By my lights, it is more plausible that an infinite past was never possible in the first place. So although I wouldn't say the Eternal Society argument is a slam-dunk hardcore proof of the infinite past being impossible, it does seem to be interesting evidence against its existence. Although the first premise is the one I'd attack if I were to attack the argument, if I were an atheist, I'd actually accept this argument as probably sound. I'd agree that there does seem to be something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past if an Eternal Society with such modest abilities could bring about contradiction. It just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that should be possible if an infinite past were possible. I believe in the finite past, but I dispute that the first cause was a personal cause. By my lights, that is the biggest weakness of first cause type arguments. Part 8. Conclusion. The Eternal Society argument against an infinite past goes like this. An Eternal Society is one that has existed for a beginningless infinite duration of time, and in each year they can do what we humans can do in contemporary society, such that in each year of its existence they can flip coins, make decisions based on the result of coin flips, and pass on information possessed in the current year to the next year. Scenario S1 is where each year they flip a coin. If the coin comes up heads and they never did a particular chant in a prior year, then they do the chant. Otherwise, they do not do the chant for that year. Last year, the coin came up heads for the first time and they did the chant. Scenario S2 is just like Scenario S1 except that the coin came up heads each year of the infinite past. If an infinite past were possible, the Eternal Society would be possible. If an Eternal Society were possible, then S1 would be possible. If S1 were possible, then S2 would be possible. S2 is not possible. Therefore, an infinite past is not possible. What I said was the worst objection was denying that scenario S2 leads to contradiction, which would thus attack the fourth premise. Symbolic logic can be used to show why it leads to contradiction. Another bad objection relied on bad math, not realizing that any infinite binary sequence would be a member of the sample space. Given the situation of the annual coin flip tradition, with all coin flip trials being mutually independent and so forth, one can prove mathematically that any infinite sequence of heads and tails is among the possible outcomes. A couple of other bad objections don't attack any premise of the argument. When seeing an objection against a logically valid argument, ask yourself whether the objection attacks the truth or justification of any premise of the argument. Because if the premises of a logically valid argument are justifiably true, the conclusion is correct regardless of what else might be true. A Steelman version of one objection attacked the mechanism for the Eternal Society's ability to instantiate scenario S2. But for scenarios S1 and S2, we can replace the message transmission mechanism with rolling dice, resulting in the Eternal Society having a correct belief in each year about whether they did the chant in a prior year. One could disagree with the second premise, say that the Eternal Society is possible, but they couldn't engage in the annual coin flipping tradition to bring about scenario S1. Because if by engaging the annual coin flipping tradition, they could create a contradiction. I don't find this plausible, though, given the explicitly defined abilities of the Eternal Society. Once you're given an Eternal Society with the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of its existence, such that in each year they can flip coins, make decisions based on coin flip results, and so forth, it's as if you need to appeal to some mysterious force to prevent them from engaging in the annual coin flipping tradition and bringing about scenario S1 by that point. I use the grandfather paradox to illustrate my point of view. It seems that if the Eternal Society with its specified abilities did exist, it would be possible for them to bring about scenario S1. Disagreeing with the third premise, saying that the scenario S1 is possible but scenario S2 is impossible, is on even weaker grounds because the dispositions of what will occur given the outcome of random experiment are the same in both cases. So I don't think that denying this premise works either. The best objection I can think of is to deny the first premise, to say that an infinite past is possible, the Eternal Society isn't. I think that is by far the most vulnerable premise, but as the original Eternal Society paradox paper says, surely there's something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past if an Eternal Society with the abilities of ordinary humans can actualize a logical contradiction. By my lights, it is more plausible that an infinite past was never possible in the first place. And even if I were an atheist, I'd be inclined to agree. I believe that the past was probably finite but had some sort of impersonal first cause, maybe a type of physical reality that is very different from the physics of our universe. And if we adopt the view that whatever begins to exist has a cause, with the first cause not beginning to exist but being atemporally timeless since it can't have an infinite past, at that point we'd have at least a de facto supernatural cause because it would have to be so different from the physics of our universe, where, among other things, causes operate within spacetime. So even if I were an atheist, I acknowledge that the finite past constitutes some non-zero evidence for theism even if it's not conclusive evidence, since even as an atheist, I'd be conceding the existence of some sort of de facto supernatural first cause. Well, how about wrap it up? This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.